to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of policy. And it's a non-partisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open and serious and informed dialogue. The Middle East program hosts on the average 40 meetings a year dealing with a variety of subjects topical to the region. The meetings cover a diversity of opinion, weighing different sides of each issue in the region. Today's meeting is the launching of the Safadi Foundation USA. We are delighted to have with us three top experts on the Middle East: Ambassador C. David Welch, Paul Salem, and Karim Sadjadpour. Before I introduce the speakers, I would like to call on Laura Allame, the Executive Director of the Safadi Foundation USA, to say a few words. Could I please just remind you to close your cell phones, Blackberries, because it interferes with our live broadcast. Laura, you have it.
Thank you, Hale. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. I just want to take a few brief moments to give you some background on our goals and objectives and the work of the Safadi Foundation in Lebanon. But first, I want to thank our distinguished panel for taking the time to be with us on this early Monday morning. They've traveled long and far distances to be here today, and also to give a special thanks to Ambassador Antoine Chedid for being with us today. Thank you so much. The Safadi Foundation in Lebanon was founded in 2001 by the current Lebanese Minister of Economy and Trade, His Excellency Mohammed Safadi, in order to fill the vacuum in the delivery of services caused by the breakdown of state institutions as a result of the civil war. Since then, under the leadership of Mrs. Mona Safadi, the Foundation has worked with multiple entities, including USAID, to improve the livelihood and participation of citizens through various development initiatives. Founded in 2008 and inspired by the resilience of the Lebanese people, Safadi Foundation USA seeks to build on the success of the Foundation in Lebanon and strengthen the capacity of civil society. Our mission in Washington is to build a national and strategic vision for Lebanon's development. We believe that a strong and effective civil society is paramount to improving the quality of Lebanon's democracy and reducing socio-economic inequalities. We are committed to supporting programs that reduce poverty, empower women, and promote institutional, political, judicial, and economic reforms that are necessary for Lebanon's long-term peace and stability. We welcome any opportunity to discuss with you and your organizations common objectives to explore ways to work together. I hope you will enjoy this morning's panel and find it useful. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Laura. Our first speaker is Ambassador C. David Welch. He's the president of Bechtel's Europe, Africa, Middle East, and Southwest Asia region. Mr. Welch is the former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and in that capacity in 2008, he signed the U.S.-Libya Comprehensive Claim Settlement Agreement, paving the way for the restoration of full diplomatic and commercial relations between the two countries after a 25-year break. Ambassador Welch also served as the U.S. Ambassador to Egypt from August 2001 to March 2005, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs 1998 to 2001, and the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs and Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. I will introduce each of the speakers as before they start speaking, and I've asked the panelists to speak for 20 minutes so that we have ample time for your questions and comments. Ambassador Welch, please.
Thank you very much, Hala. Well, good morning, everybody. And let me begin by thanking the Safadi Foundation and the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting this event. As we can see from developments in Lebanon, it seems to me a particularly appropriate time to have a discussion about where Lebanon is today and what its future is. I'm the opening speaker, so I get to contribute to the context for this discussion, and I'd like to cover in that several points briefly. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about politics in Lebanon now and security there. Second, I'd like to speak a little bit about the economic situation also, because Lebanon, of course, as a major trading center, is not invulnerable to what's going on in the world and in the region in particular. Third, I'd like to speak a little bit about U.S. relations and regional relations with Lebanon. And finally, I would come to the topic that is the headline for our discussion today, the elections there on June 7th. So if you'll permit me, I'll just go through these things. Of course, attention is riveted today in Lebanon on the impending election, but I think it would serve us well to go back a little bit and see where we were not so long ago. About a year ago, there was a struggle within Lebanon on the issue of the election of the president, and while things were moving, it seemed in a good direction for a period of time about that. They were rudely interrupted in a significant domestic crisis in May of last year. Happily, for a change, regional parties submerged their differences about what to do with respect to Lebanon and were able to support the Doha Agreement, which then provided for the election of President Suleiman. With that, with his election, of course, things moved to look ahead to what would happen vis-a-vis the parliamentary elections. After that, that doesn't end the drama politically in Lebanon, because there will have to be a new government formed, and it, in turn, will have to present a national platform to Lebanon and the world. In a sense, then, the Doha Agreement brought, though it was not itself immune to criticism, did buy some time and space for Lebanon and improve the security there sufficiently so Lebanese could look forward to these choices. But behind that immediate crisis, I think there are several things that are different in today's Lebanon than, let's say, even in 2005 when Rafiq Hariri was assassinated. And I believe it's worth highlighting those because, in a sense, they point to some policy achievements for the previous administration, but also some, I believe, wisdom on the part of Lebanon's political elite in how to address themselves to their position within the region and within the world. I think it's very important to pay attention to those words that surface often in American public statements about Lebanon's independence and sovereignty. For well over a generation, if not longer, Lebanon has suffered from intrusions on its sovereignty and compromises to its independence. Now that those principles of independence and sovereignty are politically, I think, very well grounded, and they are certainly backed by international law. The framework of UN resolutions addressing issues in Lebanon is much more robust today than it was even just a few years ago. Second, with respect to protecting Lebanon's key border with Israel and protecting Israel, the presence of a capable UNIFIL, which is much stronger physically and politically than the previous UNIFIL, is enormously important. Third, the fact that there is an international investigation into the assassination of some of Lebanon's political leadership, and that investigation has as a possible destination an international tribunal formed with Lebanese participation and support, is, I believe, in and of itself, one of the most dramatic changes we see politically in the environment in this last generation. Why is that? Because in my view, and speaking from some experience in working in Lebanon and on Lebanon for over 30 years in the American Diplomatic Service, what Lebanon has suffered from is a culture of impunity when it comes to political murder. And I think the prospect of a tribunal and the ongoing investigation that's associated with it is an important protection against these kinds of crimes. Obviously, it hasn't eliminated them, but I think it has given those who would contemplate such things a sense that there is a huge risk to doing that. In defeating this culture of impunity for the use of violence in politics in Lebanon has to be one of the most important challenges facing the Lebanese people and their leadership even today. A third thing that has changed, and this speaks to the American relationship with Lebanon, is the focus on the institutions of government and governance there. In particular, the security organizations, the Lebanese Armed Forces and the Internal Security Forces. Now, I'm not here to tell you that these organizations are able fully to satisfy all aspects of Lebanon's political opinion and what ought to be done about security in the country, but certainly today they have greater capability. Regrettably, they have no monopoly on the use of force inside of Lebanon. They're challenged by one of the political organizations that's backed by a substantial militia, and they're challenged by the presence of armed Palestinian groups, though those are somewhat more segregated in certain locations. But both of these groups, armed Palestinian organizations and Hezbollah, pose, I believe, formidable difficulty for Lebanon in the coming months in terms of how to cope with them. And the political bargain is not so obvious yet with at least the internal organizations about what will be done with respect to Hezbollah. And the risk from the Palestinian organization should not be discounted. After all, one small terrorist group, albeit heavily armed and highly motivated, could take over a month for the Lebanese army to subdue in Nahr al-Bared at very considerable cost. But I believe that was also a turning point for the leadership of the security forces in that they saw that it was within their capability, however stressful it was, to undertake that mission and in the end do it. I believe they deserve our support, and I would hope that that element of U.S. policy is not only remains but is reinforced in the coming period. I think it's important to say a few words about the economy because certainly in leaving government and moving into the private sector, there is no more captivating item on my agenda than what's happening in business these days. One might think that Lebanon, which has had its stream of economic problems over recent years, would be badly affected. And of course it is, like every other place within the area. But I would say Lebanon has weathered round one of the global economic crisis. The macroeconomic performance of the country is surprisingly strong. This is not David Welch's judgment. It's a judgment of the International Monetary Fund. There are still risks in the banking sector in Lebanon, which is very prominent in the economy there, especially the exposure to government debt. But externally, Lebanon has little exposure to the distressed assets that have plagued others. And it's not so highly leveraged outside the country and still quite liquid in it. I point to this as an example because just 2 years ago when I was in government, we were working with our friends in the Lebanese government on support for the central bank. It's interesting that isn't an issue today because I think of the sound economic management of the country. And I think this deserves some recognition and continued support from the international community because it's not all that easy to take these decisions, even in the best of times, and these are very trying times. there are forward risks too in this in the economy. Let me just mention several which I think are important. These, to some degree, don't apply only to Lebanon; they apply also to Egypt, Jordan, and the Palestinians as well. Because global liquidity is lower and growth in the Gulf in particular has been affected by the economic crisis, there are going to be knockoff effects on others. And I think in the case of Lebanon, we'll see this. Lebanese exports may well be affected. The tourism market, though it has been good in recent years and surprisingly good even after the war in 2006 and the events in May of 2008, I think tourism could still be affected because people simply have less money to spend and less inclination to do it. And remittances is an important element on the current account for Lebanon too, and I think that that bears watching. And finally, foreign direct investment and deposits in the Lebanese banking system also merit some attention. These are risks, as I said, that others will face. Even to some degree here in the United States, we face some of them. And if you look forward at the next phase of managing this economic problem, given that there will be a transition politically in Lebanon, I think it puts an even greater burden on a new government to deliver the kind of sober and experienced economic management that we have seen from this recent government. That's not a political remark, it's simply a statement of fact. Anybody who inherits those offices is going to have a big challenge. Let me say a little bit about relations with the United States and relations within the region. I think these are two critical areas for Lebanon. There's no shortage of criticism of the Bush administration's foreign policy in the Middle East. And I'm certain that when we have our discussion, perhaps some of that may even emerge here. But one thing I think that merits some positive recognition is that for the first time in as long as I can remember professionally, the United States really has a policy that can be described as pro-Lebanon. It's not associated with or derived from any other regional policy. It's not to say that it's not affected in some way or another by what else is going on in the region, but we have really devoted a lot of political attention, a great deal of support, and considerable taxpayer dollars to backing Lebanon per se. It would have been better, I think, for all of us if this had emerged in a more in a friendlier environment. But when you do face crises, sometimes you have to take advantage of them and do what you think is right. And I think that we've achieved that during very, very difficult periods for Lebanon. Now, I had, in the early days of the Obama administration, a question mark, like many, I assume, about how this would be transmitted in a new administration. We're coming on the 100th day of the new administration, and we've seen already that there is an important foreign policy focus in the Middle East generally, and given Secretary Clinton's visit to Beirut over the weekend, I think we see that there is also an emphasis on Lebanon. I think that if you look at the message there, both the symbolism of this attention and the words that are said are the clearest evidence yet that the new administration, with only 100 days in office, does recognize Lebanon as unique, that it does see it as a priority to be protected and advanced, and that it will put it in a key position in this new pattern of regional engagement that the new administration appears to be offering us. I would say this is very encouraging. I hope it is encouraging to people in Lebanon, too. Consider that the choreography of all this, too, which you may be familiar with, but I think it does bear some attention. It's not the first time the new administration has spoken out on policy vis-a-vis Lebanon. Secretary Clinton did so to Congress American representatives have elsewhere spoken about it. But it does link this political confirmation of Lebanon to the kind of support we need from Congress to deliver on things that are important to the future growth and stability of the country, in particular support for the security institutions. These statements in front of Congress and to the world earlier were then followed by the Secretary of State's visit. And, of course, she's coming into Lebanon at a quintessentially political moment. But I think she did the right thing in seeing basically the president and recognizing the importance of Rafiq Hariri's martyrdom and Lebanon's service as symbols of national unity, purpose, and of the Lebanese state. My own view, and I'm just as a personal view, is I think not only you see that support coming from the administration itself, but I believe you'll see it from Congress too. In the United States, support for Lebanon is basically bipartisan. Most of the time when I was working on Lebanon issues in front of the American Congress, the questions were to massage the tools, if you will, of our diplomacy. What were we doing with the military assistance? What was its quality and character? What impact would it have on the effective ability of Lebanon's security services? Not should we do this? And I would guess that's congressional support is going to continue. I would point out, too, that early on, after the inauguration, we saw the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee visit Beirut. I wish I could say that the support coming from within the region was as clear and as unmixed in its direction. I'm a little less sure in that respect. I think the Doha Agreement did contain the problems that we see in Lebanon, which reflect regional rivalry, but it didn't eliminate them. And it also still means that events in Lebanon, such as the election and its aftermath, could be seen by others in the region to have an impact on them, and they in turn might interfere is a heavy word, but might seek to involve themselves in this political picture in a way that would be unhealthy for Lebanon and its voters. You know, I don't know how to rank this in terms of these issues, but it is deeply troubling that the leadership of Hezbollah would seek to provide support, do whatever it was doing via Egypt to Hamas in Gaza. This is the kind of adventurism that brought a sharp and very damaging setback to Lebanon in the summer of 2006. There are high risks in that sort of thing. And as we can see, it deeply disturbs the Arab consensus, too, and puts at risk the kind of political harmony that's going to be needed to make the region face its responsibilities. And I'm stunned that the leadership of Hezbollah, which, after all, in the summer of 2006, publicly acknowledged that if they had known what would happen, they wouldn't do it again. What lesson did they learn then that they would undertake this kind of thing again? And I don't believe that whatever it was that was done was put to any kind of informed public test inside the country. So when we talk about ending the monopoly on the use of force, it's not merely that it should be ended inside of Lebanon. Its cascade outside of Lebanon should also be treated. Let me say something about the elections now. First, here's the good news. Like Lebanon's last election, I think this is going to be one of the most widely observed and watched political events in the region this year. That's enormously healthy. It's a great thing when the European Union has got people on the ground already and is lining up others to come. It's a great thing when the United States, this administration, seeks to devote funding for election observers. It is enormously important that the intelligentsia in the region, the media, the intellectuals, look at this event. And I would hope that they don't look at it merely as the traditional regional politics and Lebanese politics playing out. I hope they see it against the backdrop of what is an important, modest, albeit modest, continuing trend within the Arab world towards some form of popular legitimacy for the expression of choice about political future. Now, I don't want to exaggerate that, and there are places where it occurs more responsibly and better than in others. But in Lebanon, this is a much more transparent, involved political system than in many places. You know, some may say, well, it's still the same traditional politics, the same families dominate, the same areas vote for the same people. That is to some degree true, and that is true basically of just about any real democracy in the world. So it's not an element of criticism. The question is, what does it mean in terms of the search for a decent future for this country? You know, the political landscape right now in Lebanon is pretty familiar to most people in this room. There is a roughly even division, and this election is going to be decided in a few key districts. I think others may have more to say about that, but it's probably the case that the seats in what are predominantly Christian districts may hold the balance in the election, and thus for the selection of a new government and the formation of its political platform. In particular, and as we see even today in the news from Lebanon, there are several districts that will be very, very closely watched. The first district of Beirut, the Metten, Zahle, and probably the Kora district also. So these are 20 to 23 seats in the parliament, and those will be, I think, very, very critical in terms of where things will go. Again, as I say, there are lots of observers for this, so for those who are thinking that it may be possible to manipulate the results or challenge the choice of the voters in other respects, it's going to be a very hard job for them to do that, because the standard now having been set by the election in 2005, I think this one looks like it could proceed very well. The election doesn't end the story. In the aftermath, there will be some key issues. I think to pick up the language of the press on this, what will be the new political map of Lebanon? Will it be what we've seen the last 4 years, or will it be something different? Obviously, that depends on the outcome to some degree, but this will have an effect within regional relations and within international relations. And second question that we should ask ourselves is, we have seen, relatively speaking, reasonably good security in Lebanon in recent months. Yet the security challenges in the country, as I said earlier, are formidable and not to be dismissed. So will the effect of the Doha Agreement persist beyond the election? And will there be a positive contribution by the new government to continued security in the country in the terms that the region and the international community can embrace, and to assure that the support continues to be forthcoming? Third, for the United States, there will be a key question too, which I believe the Obama administration and Secretary Clinton in particular is managing very effectively in the public presentation, and that is, how do we assess a new government, and what will the nature of our relations with that government be? It's important, I think, not to be victim right now of the same thing we worry about from others, that is some form of interference, real and unintended, or of any other sort, in the current political debate there. So the administration is properly careful in its comments, But it does open up a policy question. You have a new government, and what will the relations be like with that government? And that will be an important question for us. And finally, it goes without saying that after the election and formation of a new government, there are still very serious political problems in the country. And as I said also, there is a global economic crisis that has an important effect on Lebanon. And those are major substantive problems any government would have to deal with. And we hope they take them on as responsibly and effectively as this last government has tried to do. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wonderful overview. Our next speaker is Paul Salem, the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Prior to joining Carnegie in 2006, he was the general director of the Forest Foundation, and from 1989 to 1999, he founded and directed the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. It was Lebanon's leading public policy think tank. Recently, Mr. Salem was a member of the Lebanese National Commission for Electoral Law Reform, a blue ribbon commission tasked with revising Lebanon's electoral laws and proposing a new system. He was also in 2002 a member of the Senior Review Committee for the UNDP Arab Human Development Report. His book was Bitter Legacy, Ideology and Politics in the Arab World, which was published by Syracuse University Press. Mr. Said. Paul, you have the
Thank you, Harry. Thank you very much. And I thank the Woodrow Wilson Center and also the Safadi Foundation. I'm very glad that they've opened the foundation in the U.S. I followed Safadi Foundation and Minister Safadi's political and development and charity work for a long time. I think he's one of the sort of a growing number of Lebanese that do their best in business and politics and development and also now in international relations, U.S.-Lebanese relations being very critical, and I salute that effort. Ambassador Welch really covered a lot of ground, and very I agree with generally what he was saying. Let me sort of also situate myself in terms of the context and how I see it. Lebanon indeed is not a sovereign state. The Syrians have left, and I think that's one of the successes of the Bush administration. More clear-cut success than in some other areas. The Syrians left at the time without warfare, without major upheaval in security terms, but at a great cost to Lebanon, to Prime Minister Hariri, and to others. But they've left and they've stayed out physically, and that I think is a significant achievement and something that Lebanon benefits from at the moment. The 2006 war was much more troubling, certainly not a success in the same terms, and that's another context. Lebanon lives now in the aftermath of the May events of 2008, governed to some degree, not governed, but organized under the principles of the Doha Agreement, which I regard, yes, as an agreement that stabilized the situation, but stabilized it in a very unstable and sort of a two-state solution, a two-state situation for Lebanon. Hezbollah does behave as a sovereign. It has its own military, its own intelligence, its own foreign policy, its own finances. And it showed in May 2008 that it sets the rules for the Lebanese state rather than the reverse. Now, this is, trying to deal with this within the context of a national dialogue, which is taking place but not going very far. And this is definitely linked to broader regional and international dynamics, Hezbollah being part of a broader dynamic. Lebanon now, I think, is benefiting from a calm in the region and in U.S. policy with relation to the region as well. Between 2004 and 2007, or I would say, Lebanon both benefited from and suffered from great upheaval in the region. Right now, to put it in the context of sort of 2009, Relations between Syria and the U.S. are sort of looking for dialogue, looking for accommodation. Where will that go? Where that will end? We don't know. Syria and Israel, Syria signaling to Israel that it wants peace talks and so on. The Israeli government currently taking a less sanguine view. Where that will go as well, we don't know. But at least we can say, compared to Syria's attitudes towards Lebanon, towards the U.S., towards Israel, towards even Saudi Arabia and others, we are now in a much softer situation. That is reflected in Lebanon as well. We're also possibly in 2009 at a period of signaling between the U.S. and Iran as well. Perhaps we'll all await the Iranian election to see if this will develop into something serious and positive. Will there be any progress on that track? And given that Hezbollah is very close to Iran, that has great significance on the Lebanese situation, Lebanese stability. So I would say these elections in June are taking place at a sort of a calm period in Lebanon's environment, very much different than 2006, 2005, and 2004. And that, I think, means that the elections will take place, I think, without much security problem, without much threat or danger. And I think the outcome of the election, we'll talk about the possible outcomes in the formation of the government, contentious as they might be, will not be accompanied by dramatic security or very serious political confrontations, because the regional and international environment is more propitious. However, this might not last beyond 2009 or beyond early 2010. In other words, the stability or calm that Lebanon is living is not homegrown. And if the regional situation or international relations vis-à-vis the region deteriorate again in 2009, possibly over the Iranian nuclear issue, possibly over Israeli Hezbollah issues or Israeli Hamas or Israeli Syria, unknowns in 2010, the calm that we see in Lebanon, a new government that might have been formed in 2009, might collapse, or we might have great regression in Lebanon if the region moves backward. 3 points about why these, putting it in a more sort of going from the broader to the more narrow, 3 reasons why these elections are important. Have some significance or some importance, but not enormously. In other words, life won't change on June 8th, and that's because the regional international context, the Lebanese balance of power, is pretty much where it will be before June 7 or after June 7. But within that broader margin, there is importance on 3 issues. One, and I'll start with this because myself, I'm a sort of a democratic activist. I've been doing in Lebanon for a long time. One issue is electoral reform, and this is maybe more of a Lebanese issue, not so much an international issue. A second is, of course, these elections will determine the balances in the next parliament. The third is that this parliament will produce a government in the context of a president who still has 5 years in his term. In other words, for the first time in 4 years, we will have 4 years ahead of us of a sitting parliament, sitting government, sitting president to tackle some of the key policy issues in security, in sovereignty, in economics, and social policy that have been left hanging for a long time, and in particular in the context possibly of a very difficult economic situation. So the first issue on electoral reform or democratization issues. Oddly enough, the elections of 2009 will be the first free and fair elections in Lebanon for 37 years. One might not, recognize that, but what I mean by that, the 72 elections were the last elections before the Lebanese Civil War in 75. We didn't have elections again until 1992. We had elections in 92, 96, and 2000, but all of those were under Syrian control and Syrian occupation. They were also held according to election laws which were not subject of consensus among the major political groups, particularly the Christians from 92 onwards. The majority of them rejected every election law from 92 onward, except this election law, the 2009 election law. The 2005 elections were held in the context of a free election, in the sense that the Syrians had left, and they were held the context of no direct foreign interference, but the election law was the same election law that had used in 2000 and was rejected by a large majority of at least the Christian community, which is sort of one of the three main pillars of the political system in Lebanon. These elections are held on what's known as the 1960s law, certainly not an ideal law. I was a member of the Electoral Reform Commission, and we certainly suggested proportional representation. We suggested a lot of things. But this law is a law that is accepted, at least by the main political groupings in the country. So I think the 2009 elections have an importance in the sense that they are a reconciliation between the Lebanese and their parliament, with all its failings in the family politics and the corruption and the money and all of that, and we all know that. But it is the first election that will probably, whose results will probably be fully recognized by winners or losers, give or take a few complaints here or there. This election law also contains the beginnings of reform. It's an election law that was put in place after a national commission was formed. Some of the reforms that were suggested were adopted in parliament. These reforms are the first reforms introduced into Lebanese election law since 1927. So it's significant as well. These are controls on campaign finance, which is already influencing some aspects of campaigning in Lebanon. Also controls on the media. And the establishment of a commission, an autonomous commission to oversee campaigning. These are also elections that are being held under the management of a Minister of Interior who is a civil society activist and a friend, and he was a member of the National Commission. He ran for a while the NGO in Lebanon, which was the Electoral Reform Democratic NGO. And it's quite something that in an Arab country, the Minister of Interior running the most crucial elections in recent history is a young civil society activist whose credentials and objectivity is really beyond reproach. The importance of this is already that there is some change in the electoral system, but also that if these elections and the reforms in them and the minister and the commission do well, it will open the door for further discussion of electoral reform in Lebanon. The 1960s law that these elections are being held on were agreed for one time only. This election law will not serve for the 2013 elections. So the debate will be opened again over election laws in Lebanon. And that for Lebanese is a very important thing. Particularly the debate over proportional representation will be opened again after these elections. And it's my conviction that proportional representation is the only thing that will break sort of the hold of the big bosses, the Zaim system in Lebanon, and the great sort of oligarchic way that politics functions in Lebanon. It's important to note that however these elections come out, the next parliament will be governed by 5 men. They might get 2 or 3 more seats here or there, but that's already the result. And political life is very, very stunted and very sort of dysfunctional as a result of that. The second point, which is on everybody's mind, is the balance of the next parliament and how are the elections likely to affect that. As Ambassador Welch indicated, as anybody who's following these elections knows, the elections will be decided in only a few districts. In a sense, these are really by-elections. Out of 26 districts, there's only 9 districts where some of the result is unknown, or some of the details of the result are unknown. Ambassador Welch mentioned some of those districts. We could get into more detail if you want in the question and answer period. In other words, 25% of the electorate, of the national electorate, and most of that 25% happen to be Christian voters, will determine the balance of the next parliament. Otherwise, in Shiite districts, Sunni districts, Druze district, the result is pretty much already known, with some very few exceptions. Nevertheless, the election is too close to call at this point. Both major camps, the March 14 and March 8 camp, can be fairly sure of getting about 58, 60 seats out of 128 in the next parliament, but they're not sure of getting a majority. Polling doesn't help tremendously in Lebanon at this point, particularly because the voting system is a bit complicated in the sense in a district, for example, Kisirwan district, you have 5 seats, and voters are free to vote for all of those 5 seats. And the lists that are formed are not fixed lists. So you could pick one person from this list, one person from another list, and every voter can do that. So simple polling and general polling might give you a general sense, but won't give you a sense as to how every voter will vote and how many people from those 5 will win or lose from the different seats. That's why even the camps themselves, who do a lot of polling, cannot predict the outcome. Obviously, there are 3 scenarios that are possible. One scenario is that nobody will win. That's a quite likely scenario because there is an emerging group of independents who position themselves a little bit close to the president, a bit informally. They might get 6 or 7 seats, or 5 or 6 seats, which might be enough to seize the middle. In other words, the 2 camps might get 60, 61 each, and this independent camp could seize 6 or 7 seats and hence have a hung parliament, or a sort of a parliament where there's 2 major groups and 1 group in the middle. The other outcome, of course, March 8th, between Hezbollah and the Free Patriotic Movement of Aoun, could get a slight majority, or March 14 could get a slight majority. Those are the possibilities. No landslide, no major shift is possible given the numbers. And as I said, in the current regional and international climate, I think a win by either side will be softened a bit by the climate in the region. Also, these slight majorities will not enable any change in the constitution, so that also limits the possibility of change. In all cases, whether it's a hung parliament, March 8 majority, or March 14 majority, immediately the attention will be on the formation of the next government. If it's a hung parliament, I think it's quite likely that we will have a full coalition government, possibly on an equal basis for March 8, March 14, and the president or this group of independents. This could be an outcome that all sides could live with, and it's not an unlikely outcome if we have a hung parliament. The prime minister in that case might be from the March 14 movement, while without the March 14 movement, having a majority in that government, but possibly headed by a March 14 prime minister. If March 14 gets a majority, their position now is that they would accept a coalition government, but they would not accept a blocking, what's called a blocking third, or a blocking veto by the March 8 camp, which is the case today. Since the Doha Agreement, the March 8 has had a blocking veto, a third plus 1, in the government, hence being able to veto any major decisions that the government can take. March 14 and Deputy Saad Hariri particularly has said if they win, they do not want to give the other side a veto, and if they lose, they don't want a veto themselves. That's the position. Now that position, I think, is it's going to be difficult to stick to, I believe, if March 14 wins a slight majority, because I think Hezbollah and the opposition, as they forced the hand of the government by force last May, they're probably willing to do it again. I wouldn't say they would be willing to do it again, close down downtown Beirut, use the military force that they used in May. I would expect possibly, but this is yet an unknown, one would have to see what the positions of some of the regional players. Will the Saudis encourage March 14 to give the blocking third or not? What will the regional and what will the U.S. position be? All of those things are unknown. If March 8 wins a victory, they've been saying that they would offer a blocking third to the March 14 coalition. And March 14 has said they don't want to take the blocking third if March 8 wins. The logic of the two sides here, I think, from March 8's position, from Hezbollah's position, Hezbollah benefits from the protection, in a sense, of the presence of March 14. In a sense that Hezbollah is protected in Lebanon from another Israeli assault or any U.S. more pressure on Hezbollah by the fact that the president and the prime minister and members of government and members of parliament are very close to the U.S. and very close to Saudi Arabia and others. And if Hezbollah eliminates March 14 from the government, they will be more exposed, like Hamas was more exposed in Gaza, and that has not been their strategy. Their strategy has been to maintain their independence in Lebanon, their autonomy and freedom of action, but maintain also, to some degree, the presence of groups that are close to the West, because that actually helps in their protection. The thinking of March 14, or summon March 14, might be the sense that, well, if March 8 wins, let them govern and let them take responsibility for that. And March 14, and particularly the Future Movement and the great connections that the Future Movement has with Saudi Arabia and the GCC states and the U.S. and their great influence over also in the economy and so on. And particularly given Lebanon's enormous debt burden already and in a global and regional economic crisis, it's possible, if not probable, that if March 14 withdraws from the government or does not participate, a March 8 government couldn't govern for long, in the sense that they would face very serious fiscal and economic problems, because this would influence Saudi economic and monetary and fiscal support and so on, could possibly influence the U.S. and Europe. In other words, a March 14 wager might be, okay, win the election, govern the country, fail, and then we'll talk again. This is sort of what happened between 1998 and 2000, when Prime Minister Hariri was forced essentially out of government, and a government took over for 2 years and ended in economic and fiscal collapse. And Rafiq Hariri at the time came back again sort of as the economic savior and so on and so forth. And that is still a very serious and probably going to get more serious as an issue, as Ambassador Welch mentioned. The impact on policy, if these different scenarios take place, initially I think will not be dramatic, in the sense that the outcome of the election will still mean that the Sunni community is led clearly by one group, Shiite community by one group, Druze community by one group, Christian community, there is competition. If one group gets a slight majority or not, if they form a government with the participation of the other or not, the major decisions, the major politics of the country, and there has been expressed respect for that from various communities towards the other community, particularly across the Sunni-Shia divide, it's unlikely that any of the parties will try to take inordinate advantage of that to sort of dramatically change the positioning of the country. Particularly that Hezbollah sort of got what it wanted last year, which was new rules of the game, respect for its own independence of action, its own military, its own intelligence. There's not a lot more that Hezbollah wants from the Lebanese state other than to continue to be left alone. And as I said, they don't want to remove the presence of March 14, which is protective of them. The risk for Lebanon, I see more, is if the regional situation breaks down in 2010, and if you have a majority in government which maybe in 2009 didn't take advantage of that majority, that group, a majority in parliament and in government, could take advantage of that majority in 2010 if the region goes back to major confrontation and major showdowns, as was the case just a few years ago. The effects, however, I mean, the government that will come into place, and I'll end with this, faces a number of key challenges. First, at the highest level of Lebanon's place in the region, Lebanon is, the region might be moving towards peace on the Syrian-Israeli track. It's a big question mark, particularly after the Israeli elections, but it is a serious possibility. If so, Lebanon is not very prepared for that. Neither its negotiating position nor Hezbollah is prepared. It would dramatically impact the scene in Lebanon in very unpredictable ways, particularly if that is taking place at a time when there is high tension with Iran. It could tear Lebanon apart again. This government also has to manage the further buildup of the Lebanese armed forces, as Ambassador Welch mentioned, and how to deal with another army, in particular Hezbollah's army, which has proved more effective or more willing to be used than the Lebanese army, and how to deal with the Palestinian issue, both in terms of granting the Palestinians economic and civilian rights to live, to begin to normalize their existence in Lebanon from the misery that they live in now, as well as dealing with the security threats and the management of some security issues related to the Palestinians. How the government will also face the challenges of the special tribunal. The tribunal is likely to begin its deliberations probably in early 2010. Nobody knows exactly what's going to come out in the investigation, but things could emerge which could be very troubling for internal Lebanese relations or possibly very troubling for Lebanese-Syrian relations. And the government would have to face that. Finally, on the economic and social level, it's been mentioned a lot, but it's probably going to get much worse before it gets better. This will be particularly critical, I believe, if March 14 is not in the government, because Lebanon will not have the cushion of the GCC states pumping in money when necessary to prop up the currency, to maintain the solvency of public finances that are carrying forward great public debt. What I'd like to leave us with is the reflection which is I think very significant. I think if there's a March 14 victory, the course will proceed, as it's been with all its, ups and downs, no major change. If there is a hung parliament, I think also with March 14 being in the Prime Minister's office and having a say along with the President, again, it will be sort of a continuation of the Doha formula and different balances. I think what most people are concerned about is, well, what if there's a March 8 victory? And as I said, in this current regional international context, I don't think it's the end of the world or a great cataclysm, but there will be a decision to be faced. There's a decision by March 14. Will they join a March 8-led government or not? That is something for March 14 to think about and consider. It's also possibly something for Saudi Arabia and others, and for the U.S. to consider two things. One is, should they encourage their friends? What's the reading of that? And secondly, how would they deal with a government which had a March 8 majority? My own view is that March 14, if it loses the election, should join the next government and should take a veto position in that next government, if offered, and should negotiate for the Prime Minister's office or a big share in naming who is to be the next Prime Minister. The reason for that, to my mind, is a number of things. First of all, I think March 14 leadership owes it to its followers to be in the government and veto decisions that the audience of March 14 cares about, rather than letting the issue, letting March 8 a full hand. Secondly, I think the presence of March 14 in government is critical for the economic stability of Lebanon in the coming year, and I think it's too high of a risk to let the country drift, and in a sense to cut its economic ties at one of its critical junctures, and I fear that might be part of the calculation. Let March 8 fail, and let the cost be so high that then March 14 could come back stronger. But as a Lebanese citizen and so on, I think that's an unwise and unwanted policy. I think for the U.S., there's two considerations. One is these considerations that I'm talking about, what would be better for Lebanon, what would be better for stability in Lebanon, in the region. Secondly, how would the U.S. deal with a government, if March 8 wins, a parliament and a government which has a majority in which Hezbollah has great influence. I mean, some people say falsely, what if Hezbollah wins the next election? I mean, as everybody knows who follows, Hezbollah itself is not winning the election. Hezbollah essentially and the Aounist movement might win the next election. How will the U.S. deal with such a government? My position would be that the U.S. should deal with whatever government the Lebanese vote, without changing its positions on what its preferences are relating to Hezbollah and policy towards Israel and Syria and so on, but not to recognize and not to deal with and not to help Lebanon in the areas that the U.S. wishes to do so, because there is a majority of a certain color. I think would be the wrong decision. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. Now we turn to Karim Sadjadpour, an associate in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. He joined Carnegie after 4 years as the chief Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group based in Tehran and Washington. He managed to leave Iran without being arrested and ending up in jail, despite his research. A leading researcher on Iran, Sadjadpour has conducted dozens of interviews with senior Iranian officials and hundreds with Iranian intellectuals, clerics, dissidents, paramilitary, businessmen, students, activists, and youth, among others. He has been the recipient of numerous academic awards, including a Fulbright Scholarship, and was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in Davos. He's also a board member of the Banu Foundation, an organization dedicated to assisting grassroots organizations that are empowering women worldwide. Karim, you have the floor, please. It works.
Okay, thank you so much to the Wilson Center for inviting me in the Safadi Foundation. I don't think it's on my bio that I spent also a year in Lebanon as a Fulbright Scholar in 2004, so I have a great deal of affection for Lebanon, and I think I'm probably one of the few people who's lived both in Beirut and in Tehran, and I'm not on the FBI's most wanted list.
Or so you think.
That's what I think. That's right. I'd like to make four broad policy observations. Four kind of broad observations about the Iranian relationship with Lebanon, about the Iranian relationship with Hezbollah, and then make three kind of policy observations. And the first point, whenever I think about the Iranian relationship with Hezbollah, I'm always reminded of this passage from Thomas Friedman's book, From Beirut to Jerusalem. And in a moment of disillusionment, Friedman, this was in the 1980s, Friedman says that the relationship between Israelis and American Jews is like a superficial love affair between a man and a woman. Israelis love American Jews for their money, and American Jews love Israelis for their body. And when I think about the Iran-Hezbollah relationship, there's certain parallels in the sense that I believe that Iran's support for Hezbollah is more for its body. Iran loves Hezbollah for its body, its strategic location north of Israel. And Hezbollah loves Iran for its money. And let me unpack this comment a bit. I certainly don't want to downplay the Shiites' solidarity between Iran and Hezbollah, and there's very real historical links between Iran and Lebanese Shiites. But at the same time, there are marginalized Shiite communities throughout the Middle East and throughout the Gulf who actually are of Iranian origin. Yet you don't see the same amount of Iranian support for these Shiite groups as for Hezbollah. Okay, thank you. And if you go back to the 1970s and you read Khomeini's writings on Lebanon, you realize that there was a real tension between Khomeini's vision for Lebanon and that of Iranian Shiite activists like Musa Sadr, whom I'm sure is very familiar to all of you, in the sense that for Musa Sadr and others, ameliorating the condition of Lebanon Shiites was a real priority, and the struggle against Israel was of secondary importance. Whereas I think for Khomeini it was really the opposite. The support for Lebanese Shiites was much more about struggling against Israel and ameliorating the situation of the Lebanese Shiites and respect for Lebanese Shiites within the context of a sovereign Lebanon was of secondary importance. So again, for I think the Khomeini strand of the Iranian Revolution, it was much more about Israel than it was about Lebanon in terms of their support for Shiite groups. Now, I think another strand which has emerged in the last decade or so is what I would call the Rafsanjani strand after the former Iranian President Hashemi Rafsanjani, in the sense that I think they recognize that within the context of a U.S.-Iran diplomatic accommodation, it makes sense for Iran to change its relationship with Hezbollah, to quote-unquote turn Iran, to take steps to turn Hezbollah into a mere civilian entity rather than a militant organization. But it doesn't make sense to do that unilaterally. They view it as a bargaining chip, and they say, why should we do this before the United States offers us certain diplomatic accommodation in return? But again, I would argue that at this moment, in 2009, with Ahmadinejad as president and Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, being more powerful than he's ever been, the Khomeini's vision for the Middle East and the Khomeini's vision for Iran's support for Lebanese Shiites is the most powerful strand. And what I argue, and I think I'm very much in the minority when I argue this among Iran experts and analysts, is that you oftentimes hear that Iran is quote-unquote playing the Palestinian card in order to transcend the Sunni-Arab divide, in order to become a regional hegemon. It allows Persian Shiite Iran to transcend the Sunni-Arab divide. I would argue, in fact, for Ayatollah Khamenei, his support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and his opposition to Israel is much more earnest, in the sense that he's not simply doing this because he wants to gain more leverage vis-a-vis the United States in order to do a deal with the United States. I think actually it's quite genuine, and I don't think he would be willing to relinquish Iranian support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, even in the context of a U.S.-Iran diplomatic accommodation. And again, I think I'm in the minority there, but I do believe that for someone like Khamenei, Hezbollah is a very important organization, very close to his heart, and I think he certainly doesn't see these groups as Iranian puppets. He says these groups, have legitimate indigenous support, and why should we relinquish our support for them now, just when their stock has been rising throughout the region? Now, what about the Lebanese Shiite aspect of the Hezbollah-Iran relationship? And I argue that, again, Hezbollah loves Iran for its money, in the sense that I think when you talk to Lebanese Shiites, and again, when I was based in Lebanon, I used to oftentimes travel to the south and to Dahya, and when I would tell people I'm Iranian, immediately they would express a great deal of affection and start praising the Iranian government. But then when you would ask the second and third question, beyond their thoughts about Iran, and say, well, are you interested in the Iranian system of governance being exported to Lebanon, namely the Walayat al-Fiqh system? They say, no, we're quite happy with having more social freedoms. We're not interested in importing the Iranian system of governance. When you would ask them about their religious inclinations, I would say, apart from a small group of very hardcore Hezbollah supporters, they would express much more affection for more quietist clerics like Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, or Ayatollah Fazlallah in Lebanon itself, and much less for Khamenei. So I think that the Lebanese Shiite affection for Ayatollah Khamenei is much more economically and politically expedient, rather than motivated by religious inclinations. Now, the other thing I think about when I think about the Iran-Hezbollah relationship and Iran's vision for the broader Middle East, I always think about an anecdote, a conversation I had with a senior Iranian official a couple of years ago. And I relate to him a question which a Lebanese Shiite friend of mine once asked me. He said, think of all the money Iran has spent over the years on Hezbollah. From Hezbollah's inception in 1982, we're talking, conservative estimates, even a couple, $2-3 billion. And think of how many Lebanese Shiites Iran could have educated to become doctors and lawyers and engineers instead of arming Hezbollah. And think of how much better off that community would be vis-a-vis Israel. And likewise, the Palestinians. Think of how many Palestinians Iran could have educated to become doctors and lawyers and engineers over the past 2-3 generations. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, tens of thousands of young men who could have been sent off to elite universities instead of arming Hamas or Islamic Jihad. And his response to me was very telling. He said, what good would it have done for Iran had we educated these young men? I said, what do you mean? He said, do you think had we educated them to become doctors and lawyers and engineers, they're going to come back to South Lebanon and Gaza and fight Israel? Of course not. They will remain doctors and lawyers and engineers. And it kind of crystallized for me in that moment. Iran's very cognizant of its strengths and is very cognizant of its weaknesses. and is very cognizant of the fact that it can be the champions of the mustazafon, as we say, the downtrodden, the dispossessed, and the alienated. But it recognizes it can't be the champions of the upwardly mobile. And, in this sense, I sometimes compare, I say Iran is to the Middle East what Rush Limbaugh is to the United States, in the sense that they both kind of peddle the politics of cynicism and alienation, and they thrive, their stock is highest when the region is in the throes of tumult and chaos. So by definition, Iran believes its constituents in Lebanon and elsewhere throughout the region are the mustazafan, the downtrodden and the alienated. And I think, a critique of U.S. and Israeli policies over the last several years has been that, the 2003 Iraq war, the 2006 Israeli war against Lebanon, and the more recent war in Gaza were all prosecuted with the subtext of curbing Iranian influence in the Middle East. But by increasing the ranks of the alienated and the downtrodden and dispossessed, these wars have actually created more fertile ground for Iran's ideology to resonate throughout the region. Now, the third point about Hezbollah's role within Lebanon, there's an interesting. I've done a study of the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, and as I said earlier, he's emerged more powerful than he's ever been in his 20-year tenure as leader, and it's a very interesting model of leadership and governance, because I call it, his governing style, his position is power without accountability. What do I mean by that? By far, if you look at the major institutions, the most important institutions within Iran, the institution of the presidency, the institution of the parliament, the Revolutionary Guards, the Guardian Council, they're all led by individuals who are either directly appointed by Khamenei or unfailingly loyal to him. But at the same time, when people complain in Iran, and they do incessantly, about the shortcomings of the regime, they never complain about the leader. They will never say, the leader has screwed up the economy. It's because of Khamenei that, our per capita income has gone way down, inflation rate is way up. The blame always goes to the president. I think Khaled can probably attest to this as well. When Khatami was president, they say he's not strong enough, he hasn't met our promises, he talked a lot about democracy and civil society, but he hasn't done anything for us. Now with Ahmadinejad, the complaint is, he was going to put oil money on our dinner tables, and he hasn't done it. And rarely have I heard someone say, Khamenei hasn't done anything for us, despite the fact that he has the vast majority of the constitutional authority. And many of the things that Khatami actually did want to do when he was president were blocked by Khamenei. So it's an interesting dynamic of, again, kind of power without accountability. And I think my own opinion is that Hezbollah aspires to the same type of power in Lebanon, in the sense that they want to have tremendous influence. But I don't think that they're certainly not interested in the accountability that comes along with power. And I think for that reason, they're probably somewhat ambivalent about these elections, in the sense that, being on the outside, in a way, they can have their cake and eat it too. They have a great deal of influence. But again, when people complain about economic malaise and dysfunction and corruption in Lebanon, Hezbollah is rarely the culprit which they complain about. And I think when and if they are in a position of more public authority or more obvious authority, I think that accountability that comes along with power is something that they probably feel somewhat ambivalent about. And maybe Paul can expand on that more if he agrees with what I have to say. And interestingly, I would say that the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah, the public relationship, is also along these lines of this model, power without accountability, in the sense that when Iran wants to project its influence vis-a-vis the United States and vis-a-vis others, it always talks about its influence over Hezbollah. We have all these chips in our bag. We have influence in Iraq, we have influence over Hamas, we have influence over Lebanon. But then when something really bad happens, if Hezbollah kidnaps Israeli soldiers, they'll say, no, Hezbollah is totally autonomous. They're independent. They don't answer to us. So again, I think that they like to, at moments when they want to project power, they will talk about their influence over Hezbollah. But then in more troubling times, they will say, no, this group is autonomous or it's independent. And again, my understanding of the Iran-Hezbollah relationship is that it macro-manages Hezbollah much more than it micromanages it. And these small nuances which Paul and Ambassador Welch were talking about in terms of, the specific districts in Lebanon where the elections could go either way, etc. I don't think Iran gets into that type of micro detail in Lebanon. They defer to Nasrallah's leadership, but much more on a macro level. They provide both financial patronage, obviously military patronage, and certainly moral patronage. Now, lastly, on the Iran-Syria relationship, the dynamics between Iran and Syria and its effect on what happens in Lebanon, I think there's been 3 important flashpoints the last decade which have really changed the dynamics between Iran and Syria and has allowed Iran to have much more leverage in Lebanon vis-a-vis Syria than it did during the 1980s and 1990s. And I think the first important point is the death of Hafez al-Assad. And for Hafez al-Assad, it was important to limit Iranian influence in Lebanon. There was even times when you had Iranian-Syrian collusion in fighting Iraq. When Iran was fighting Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war, Syria was very much supportive. But you had them supporting opposing actors in the 1980s in Lebanon. So for Hafez al-Assad, he very much wanted to limit Iranian influence in Lebanon. And I think since his death, it's been more difficult for Bashar, or it's been less of a priority for Bashar al-Assad to limit Iranian influence. Second was the U.S. removal of Saddam Hussein, because during the times of Saddam, I think Iran in a way had to be more indulgent of Syrian aims in Lebanon because they very much relied on Syria as a close ally against Saddam. But now when Saddam has been removed and you have Iran's Shiite co-religionists in a position of influence in Baghdad, I think Iran feels they have to indulge Syria less in Lebanon. They're less reliant on Syria. And lastly, obviously, is the assassination of Rafiq Hariri and the impact, the pressure that's put on Syria. And I think that Iran now feels it has to restrain itself less in exerting its influence in Lebanon. So 3 policy observations I wanted to close on. And the first is a quote which I'm always reminded of from the great Lebanese historian Kamal Salibi. It says, quote, great powers should not get involved in the politics of small tribes. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here in terms of this new SE administration. And these small tribes are no longer small tribes. They're quite large tribes when we're talking about Sunni, Shiites, etc. But the point I'm trying to make is that there certainly shouldn't be a Sunni policy in Lebanon, a Shiite policy in Lebanon, a Druze policy. It should be a pro-Lebanon party. And we certainly shouldn't be seen as picking one sect or group over another. And again, I think I'm preaching to the choir here, and as Ambassador Welch mentioned, I think that was one of the strong points of Bush administration policy in the Middle East. Second point is the issue of what I call the spoilers. And there's a friend of mine now in prison in Tehran, as some of you may know, Roxana Saberi. And my theory is that throughout the last few decades, whenever there have been moments of potential confidence building between the United States and Iran, there are certain actors within Iran who have financial and political interests in retaining the status quo and do not want to see any type of rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran because they stand to lose. And again, during these moments of potential confidence building, they do their best to try to torpedo it, to sabotage it. And, I would put Roxana's case within that context. But these actors are not only Iranian actors. Hezbollah and groups like Hamas stand to lose enormously if there is a U.S.-Iran rapprochement. And I would put these groups also within the context of these spoilers. And a very good example of this is in 2002. In January of 2002, after September 11th, there was a convergence of interest between the United States and Iran. Both countries were opposed to the Taliban. Iran almost had fought a war against the Taliban several years prior. And they were working together in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, mid-January 2002, there's a ship intercepted on its way to Gaza with, I think, several tons of weapons which say made in Iran on them. And it was obvious that whoever had sent these weapons wanted to get caught, wanted to leave fingerprints. And they did. And their goal was to sabotage any type of confidence building with the United States and Iran. And they did, because 2 weeks later was President Bush's axis of evil speech. And I think it's now, as evidence trickled out about this case, it became clear that Ahmad Mughniya had some type of a link to it. And again, I think that you have these elements within Hezbollah who understand that if there is to be a U.S.-Iran rapprochement, they stand to lose major financial support from Iran, because that's going to be one of the first things that would have to go in the context of U.S.-Iran diplomatic accommodation. And I think they have an incentive to try to sabotage it. And I think it's going to take real discipline and real political courage on the part of any U.S. administration to carry forward with engaging Iran, despite the fact of these things happening on the side, whether it's the imprisonment of innocent Iranian Americans or it's weapons on their way to Hezbollah or Hamas, which are interceded. It's going to take real political courage on the part of the Obama administration to carry onward with engagement, because there's going to be a lot of voices within Congress and elsewhere who say, you see, it's an exercise in futility to engage these incorrigible radicals, and we should revert back to the politics of coercion and isolation, which is in fact very much what these spoilers want, because this is the atmosphere in which they thrive in. Last point I'll make is, how do you go about trying, if you're a U.S. official, how do you go about trying to get all of these important pieces in place to reach some type of a Palestinian-Israeli modus vivendi, a U.S.-Iran rapprochement? How would you go about doing it? The approach of the Bush administration with Annapolis meetings was to kind of try to unite the moderate groups and moderate countries within the region at the expense of the more hardline groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And I would argue this is the wrong approach to publicly advertise it as such, because you simply incentivize then these hardliners to try to sabotage the entire process. If you say if you announce publicly we're convening this Annapolis meeting, and it's about uniting the moderates and also bringing about Arab-Israeli peace, you send the signal to the Iranians and to Hezbollah and Hamas to say, well, if this is about isolating us, if this is opposed to our interests, we're going to make sure that we rain on the parade. Now, the opposite of that is that you invite these groups to partake in these talks, which I think is equally unrealistic, because it's, as I say, it's like inviting vegetarians to a barbecue. They disagree with the fundamental premise of what you're trying to do. They oppose a two-state solution. So I think it's very unrealistic to invite them to partake in talks about a two-state solution. So if you can't do either of these two, how do you go about defanging Iran? And my argument is that we don't need Iran to play a cooperative role in Palestinian-Israeli talks. We just need to have them cease playing a destructive role. I don't think they're capable. This current government in Iran is not capable of playing a constructive role in reaching a two-state solution. They're very capable of playing a destructive role. And I think that's what we have to prevent. And how I would go about doing it is in a way similar to what the Obama administration is doing now, in the sense that you try to reinvigorate Palestinian-Israeli talks. You have a separate dialogue between the U.S. and Syria and Israel. I think that's very, very important. And you defang Iran by having a bilateral dialogue with them. And you say, this is not, these Palestinian-Israeli talks, the Syrian-Israeli talks, the U.S.-Syria talks are not about isolating Iran. That's a separate track. And we want to have our own bilateral dialogue with you. And I think that, the one caveat in all of this is that Iran has long said that they'll support whatever agreement which the Palestinians and Israelis themselves agree upon. And I'm sorry, I know this was about Lebanon. I'm sorry to have ended this on Palestine and Israel, but I just wanted to put all the different pieces together at the end of it, and I'm happy to go into questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We're opening the floor to questions, please. Yes, Keith, please just wait for the mic and identify yourself too, please. Thank you. In the back. In the back, please.
All right. First of all, wonderful presentation, everybody. It's real worth coming. But I just wanted to throw this out. Hunter Thompson once said, when things get weird, the weird turn pro. And I don't really see that happening now as things are starting to get a little weird. I noticed that recently Iran has revitalized the Bahrain sovereignty issue somewhere out of the blue, which we haven't heard from in at least a decade, maybe longer. And also there's this little incident in Egypt in which there's some suspicion that Hezbollah was organizing some kind of cell to commit mischief, at least according to the Egyptians anyway. So I was wondering how, I mean, I agree, Karim, of course, that there are actors in Iran that cannot countenance any kind of rapprochement, and maybe you're right that the Syrian-American rapprochement might be the most convenient way to at least throw a wrench in all those things. But I really don't see, well, also, if I can just make a slight correction, I don't think that they wanted the Carnegie to be intercepted. Because it was just one of many or several other ships that were doing the same thing. And also they had the pipeline through the Damascus airport for Hezbollah that the Turks allegedly interdicted at some point earlier in this decade. So I'm not so sure that was clearly to demonstrate Iran's influence. I think they really wanted the weapons to get through. And what it did have more an impact on than anything else was American relations with Yasser Arafat. I think that was really the key point in that tipping point. Anyway, as you connected everything together, and it wasn't really exactly about Lebanon, I mean, I would just be wondering how all we can respond to a more regional approach by a lot of these spoilers. I mean, everyone always talks about the Iraqi Shia, but that's anyway, that's it. That was my question. How can we respond to the expanded activities of regional spoilers?
Thank you. Ambassador Welch, you want to start, and then we'll move on.
Karim, you opened up that subject.
Just kind of worms. You can.
Well, first of all, let me apologize in advance for what I'm about to say, because it may disappoint you a little bit. Had a modest role in the previous administration and a long career in the American Foreign Service. So I don't style myself like a great authority on these things. There are two groups from the previous administration now. One is quite vocal, and the other is rather more silent. I fall into the latter category. I have a great deal of respect for what the new administration is trying to do. Having worked on some of these problems, I know that they are really quite taxing, and I'd like to see them succeed. I do believe Americans generally will have to struggle with a couple of questions, and Karim's done a pretty good job of illuminating that, but he was talking about people out in the region, not about us. And we need to look at ourselves a little bit here. What are those two things? You know, there's an American tendency to become, how do I put this, misquote Alan Greenspan, sort of irrationally excited about some of these non-state or other actors. And that tempts us in certain directions. And we shouldn't overestimate their capability or effect, but some of our actions or the actions of others might have the result that they have a greater effect. I think Karim spoke to that, but he labeled it to be policy related with the previous administration. I think you can actually step back further from that. A friend of mine in the Gulf once described Iran I think he was alluding to a peacock as a bird with big feathers but a small body. Again, we need to put the threat in a sober context. Second point I would say is I see some public bouncing around the question that we've been touching on here, which is, do you have a Palestinian or Lebanese problem because of Iran, or do you have an Iran problem because of the Palestinian issue or issues within Lebanon? How Americans answer that question, I think, is critically important to the kinds of outcomes we're talking about. Now, third point I'd make, where looking forward, I don't think that, I take the point that you need to pursue these options of engagement at a minimum to inoculate, have a prophylaxis against interference. But that also sounds to me like you might have a preemptive capitulation to some of the other things that might be going on. And I don't see any problem with, having every now and then either a public or a less public rejoinder to some of those things. I mean, look at the position of Cairo today in dealing with whatever it was that happened through Egyptian territory. Well, I think they're quite right to be mad, and I think we should support them in trying to stop that before it occurs, halt it when it is occurring, and then be at their side in dealing with the consequences when we haven't succeeded in the former two. So we should not unilaterally disarmed in pursuing these other diplomatic options, because be assured there are those elements that are definitely going to use these situations to their advantage, and they should get the right answer.
Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, in terms of spoilers, it's certainly the case now that Israel is one of the major ones in terms of any major movement in the region, and has been for some time. And unless also the U.S. administration addresses that very fundamental public opposition to progress really on the two tracks and so on, the whole region is going to be very ripe for other smaller spoilers to say, well, we told you so, and Israel's not going to do anything, and one shouldn't forget about that. The Egypt-Hezbollah situation is very, very major and very serious, and reflects sort of a struggle of power over two arenas, as does the Bahrain issue. The Bahrain issue signals the Iranian Gulf struggle over the future of the Persian Gulf, and that remains a major issue going down over the next 5 to 10 years. Iran is by far the largest player on the Gulf. If current Iraq ends up an ally of Iran, then, it sort of over-dominates the Gulf. And whereas the GCC countries are trying to keep the Americans in the Gulf and trying to get the Iranians to accept eventually participation, 5-10 years down the road in the Gulf security structure, Iranians are basically proposing that they will dominate any future Gulf security structure, and they will allow roles for the GCC and for others. And the Gulf Arabs and the Iranians are not at all on the same page on that, and that is a conflict area of itself, let alone Iraq. The other struggle is in the Levant area between Egypt, Syria, Israel, and so on. And the Gaza war, it had all kinds of layers, but one major layer was Iran basically threatening Egypt directly. And the third day of the war, Nasrallah made a major speech threatening to overthrow the Egyptian government, basically. And that's how the Egyptians read it, and that means Iran is speaking. And it was well known that Iran has intelligence assets in Egypt, in the Egyptian army, in the Egyptian society, and in Egyptian intelligence, let alone the guy that was caught who works for Hezbollah, near the Gaza Strip. They didn't take it any higher than that. But this is really a major Egyptian-Iranian standoff as to, what the red line is, and don't mess with us. And I sort of agree that Egypt is right to draw the line there. It's also a signal from Iran that if you don't deal with us, and if you don't sort of talk with us and do some of the things that we want, we not only can be troublesome in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Gulf and in Syria and in Lebanon and Palestine, we can bring down Egypt and Jordan eventually. So this is very, very big stuff which got the Arabs' attention and I'm sure got the Americans' attention as well.
Karim?
Well, I think that Ambassador Welch and Paul put it wonderfully, and about Iran as a peacock. I oftentimes think of this old line from Teddy Roosevelt, who said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And I tell the Iranians that they speak loudly and carry a small stick. I think my response will sound a bit Pollyannish in terms of, how do we limit the effect of the spoilers, how do we limit Iranian influence, etc. And I'll go back to the point that I made earlier, that Iran recognizes that its ideology thrives in a region which is in the throes of tumult and which people feel alienated and dispossessed, etc. And again, I think this sounds Pollyannish, but I think that if were to limit Iranian influence in the region or limit the appeal of Iran's message throughout the region, we have to try to drain this swamp of cynicism and alienation which exists. And I think that entails spending much more money on soft power measures, creating universities, educational aid, etc., and much less money on hard power. I understand this is not an overnight project; it's a generational project. It sounds Pollyannish, but I look forward to the day when I travel to Egypt and Syria and elsewhere, and I tell people I'm Iranian, and I don't have them sing the praises of President Ahmadinejad.
Okay.
Mona, please, just wait for the mic. It's coming this way. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Mona Yakubian from the U.S. Institute of Peace. My question is for Ambassador Welch. I want to, referencing Paul's scenarios, ask you to speculate a little bit on how you would see the Hill respond in the event of a slight March 8th victory in Lebanon, and by extension also the executive.
Hi, Mona. You would give me a question like that, causing me to risk violating what I said I wouldn't do. Well, I was trying to be serious when I said that for Americans there's a struggle in not overreacting, not getting irrationally excited. It's a really hard thing to do because you have different political interests here, and sometimes these things can crystallize in a very unfortunate way and limit options. I mean, I'm sort of in favor of having the range of those options available and taking a sober decision about what works. It's hard to explain also to Americans the unique thing that is the Lebanese polity. It's, Lebanon is what it is, and we've been talking a lot about the region, but some of the greatest vulnerabilities for this country, especially in the last generation, have been the people themselves. They can be preyed upon, and they prey upon themselves. So if you look at the election outcome and some of the possible scenarios, these are the right questions to put forward, but the answers in each case are not going to be so simple because, I had a hard time explaining the Doha Agreement. I understood its vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and yet I thought it was important on balance to have the measure of political stability and security that would be needed so Lebanon would compose itself and get a president and then move toward the next political stage. In short, I saw the benefits as greater than the risks. That doesn't mean I didn't agree that there were risks. And I think that after this election, this administration will have to make similar decisions. I've learned that it's wonderful to speculate about crisp outcomes in foreign policy, but they rarely are there. And Lebanon is a hugely complicated place. And I wouldn't dismiss that, as we've seen more recently in other places, you can get unusual partnerships in a coalition government. And that will introduce its own complexities, too. We may not get a crisp answer. It's good that this administration has made Lebanon a priority, as I said at the very outset, because with that focus, I believe you get started on the understanding of what works in that context, and listening to the Lebanese themselves about how they feel our help might be best directed, so that it reduces some of those risks and heightens some of the benefits is, I think, the way to go. Happily, I don't have to do that on June 8th.
A follow-up to Mona's question to Paul. Supposedly, May 8 wins, and May 14 does not necessarily join in and does not have a prime minister. So May 8, March 8 has to produce. How do you anticipate what sort of relations will they have with the United States? Because they have to deal with the United States.
Well, as I said, they would prefer March 14 to be in. But if March 14 is not, they will seek they would seek to present a very positive face towards the Arab world, Saudi Arabia, the GCC states, and to the United States. They would be less effusive and less political about that, but that is what they would seek. For the GCC states, they would seek it for very clear two main reasons. They don't want Sunni Shia attention, and they need they need economic help. For the U.S., they want to, they want to protect themselves from any negative impact of being isolated by the United States or marginalized by the United States, both in security terms and in economic terms. And this is particularly something that at this stage Syria wants as well. And through Lebanon, today Syria is eagerly and desperately signaling towards the U.S. much more clearly than the Iranians, who may or may not be signaling at all. We don't know. The Syrians want a deal with the U.S., and they will do a lot to try to get that deal, and they think they can get a deal with this administration. So I think any new government in Lebanon will try to be sending all kinds of positive signals.
David?
Dave Ottaway, I'm a senior scholar here. Paul, I have a question for you on the Christian community of Lebanon and whether or not there's a rethink going on about among the supporters of Ayoun, since it doesn't look like he's going to become president in any near future. Are they beginning to, since this election's, I guess, going to be decided by how the Christians vote, what's happening among the supporters of Ayoun?
Well, Aoun has lost a lot of support from his high point in 2005, where maybe in 2005 he did get 65 or 75% of the Christian vote. Right now he's probably around 35, 40, or 30 solid, but in an election when you have a choice between two groups, he might easily get 50 or more. So already two things have affected Aoun. One is that his alliance with Hezbollah didn't go over well with many Christians. It got worse during the takeover of Beirut in May. Again, he, not very defensible from most Christian public opinion point of view. However, he has a very strong core support because the alternative to him is a number of Christian candidates, none of whom has seized the imagination. It's sort of like a U.S. primary. I mean, there might be candidates with good ideas and, say all the right things, but they never make it, Somebody like Nasib Lahoud, who, around a dinner table, everybody likes Nasib Lahoud, and he says the right things, and people agree with his positions, but he doesn't grab the imagination. Samir Jaja, has a bad legacy. Amin Jmail was already president. So Aoun benefits from the absence of any other major polarizing, positively, figure. The emerging challenge really comes from the new president, Michel Sleiman, who is probably trying to position himself to become later on the main Christian leader in the absence of other major Christian leaders. And given the fact that Aoun is not president, might not live another 5 years to be the next president, and hence Michel Sleiman could end up, seizing a lot of that. But the core support that Aoun enjoys is because, unlike the other Christian leaders in March 14, they are perceived by many Christians as being subordinate in March 14 to Saad al-Hariri and to Walid Jumblat. So they come sort of third in the public imagination. And from a tribal Christian perspective, that's not a position of strength, whereas Aoun projects strength. His craziness kind of adds to his sense of independence, say whatever, he'll do whatever. And his alliance with Hezbollah lost him a lot of support, but also was accepted by a lot of people. They perceived it as an alliance by a strong Aoun with a strong Hezbollah, and also that it's an alliance against a Sunni dominance, which is perceived by some Christians as more dangerous than Shiite power. And they perceive Sunni fundamentalism as more corrosive and more anti-Christian than Shia fundamentalism. There might be something to that, and that's part of the debate also in the Christian neighborhood. But it's true that post-election, Aoun will do very well in these elections. He will come out with a block of around 30 deputies, up 8 or 9 seats from his current block. The real question is, when Aoun dies, the move, it probably will die with him. Like when Bashir Ismail died, there's no real legacy. And the squabble will be on to inherit Aoun, and probably not anybody of his group will be able to inherit him, and that will be in the future.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Joe Saadi from Radio Sawa, and the question is, I have a little bit of difficulty to reconcile the concept of sovereignty for Lebanon with the concept of Lebanon being subjected to regional spoilers. How can a country be sovereign when it cannot make any decision or implement any decision if the region doesn't allow it to do so?
Who's the question for? Because I don't think...
the question is, Ambassador Welch spoke about a U.S. policy for Lebanon that is, for the first time, pro-Lebanon, and he highlighted the concept of sovereignty for Lebanon, saying that this is not merely a word, but it has become enshrined in the American diplomatic literature, and then it gave effect later on. And then, Paul and Karim, because they have spoke about the region and the regional spoilers.
Okay. Karim, you want
I don't think that the example I would give is that a U.S. goal in Iran is democracy, and Iran is not democratic. I see a similar parallel. There's the U.S. goal in Lebanon is pro-Lebanon, Lebanese sovereignty, but Lebanon is not sovereign. I don't see these are two very difficult things to reconcile. I appreciate that, but I don't see it being disingenuous on the U.S. part. I don't know if you agree.
Well, I was trying to highlight that because I agree it's a problem. I think there are three issues there that inform our attention to Lebanon. One is we do want to enshrine its sovereignty and protect it with whatever instruments are available, including international law. And I believe we've marshaled more of those more effectively in recent years than not. But the infringements on Lebanon's sovereignty are why you have that policy in the first place. These are risks that we know, and so we're looking for ways to answer them, and that is, I think, an important contribution has been made in the last several years. Second thing is, Lebanon is challenged from within, and the institutions of statehood are actually not very strong. So that also needs support and attention. And partly that's if the government does perform, then it will, I think, be supported by its own people. But also the international community and the region has to do something to help there, and I've mentioned that earlier on. Third, I think the concept of what is the nation is in itself a troubling one still for Lebanese. And it stands behind the election that we're discussing. That's not something that we, the United States, can offer any made in Washington cures for, at least all that easily. And I would, to be honest, caution against that. But Lebanese themselves have to answer those questions. And maybe as some of these political changes occur, they'll see that they have a greater variety of ways to answer it. I hope so.
Let me just comment on that. I mean, the U.S. definitely helped Lebanon get part of its sovereignty back by pushing the Syrians out. I think that is very clear. It's a historic thing. The Syrians were never going to leave, and they've left, and they're not coming back. However, Lebanon remains, for the Syrians and for the Iranians, an area of proxy war through Hezbollah. Lebanon has been an area of proxy war for 40 years. 40 years, since 68, 69, when the Palestinians were there as a result of the 67 war. To be practical, the only way realistically for Lebanon to regain its full sovereignty and not to be an arena of proxy war is through peace between Syria and Israel. That's the linchpin for Lebanon. When Israel occupied the Golan Heights, within a year, Lebanon became an arena, and we've been so, and we will stay so for decades unless the Golan is given back in the context of a land for peace deal. Any imagination that Lebanon will regain its sovereignty and Syria will give up its proxy role in Lebanon, which enables an Iranian proxy role in Lebanon because the Syrians have it, is nice, but it's unrealistic. So for Lebanon, what we need from the regional players, from the U.S., from Russia and others, is to encourage as much as possible the Syrian-Israeli peace track. And it's very good today that unlike the peace track in 96 or 2000, the U.S. position now is completely pro-Lebanon. Lebanon today, in a peace deal between Syria and Israel, if the U.S. is on the table, Lebanon's protected, unlike in the 90s. And that's great credit to the U.S. position, and we need it, but we need peace. Without it, we will be an occasionally stable arena for warfare.
Michael Hudson, please.
From Georgetown University. I was wondering if Secretary of State Clinton's recent visit to Beirut was an example of big powers engaging in the affairs of small tribes. And I'm wondering if her speeches and statements there essentially were a kind of a campaign boost for March 14th. And is that consistent with the notion of the U.S. Pursuing a pro-Lebanon policy rather than, say, a pro-March 14th anti-Iran policy? For either Paul or the ambassador. Well,
I was encouraged that the Secretary of State went to Beirut because it shows a priority and a focus. I thought it was choreographed well to try and strike a pro-Lebanon approach and to have the main interaction, the only interaction really in the visit, be with the president. And I would assume, but I don't know, that what was excluded was deliberately excluded. It wasn't a scheduling issue, if you will. So for those two reasons, I thought this was a very encouraging sign. And again, as I said earlier, when you do engagement, let's use that big word since it's so much in the air these first 100 days, I think that's a good thing. But you have to have a toolkit that doesn't suggest to anyone, publicly or privately, that you've disarmed yourself in front of an opposition that you know is not only there, but is going to be coming at you in some way. I thought they carved the right balance.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, the way it was handled and the scheduling and so on, I think was fair and went over well. I think it was natural that she also supported sort of the Cedar Revolution, all of that, not to be disingenuous and assume that the U.S. didn't have a sort of a position on that. I don't think it will have any impact on the elections whatsoever. The elections are boiling down to very local issues of a few candidates in a few districts. And I still think, I think it's very important that the U.S. continues to signal to Syria that Lebanon is extremely important. It may be small, it's not a great power, but the U.S. will commit at the highest level. And for Secretary Clinton to go is very, very good in terms of what the Syrians later on might or might not bargain for or negotiate for. But in the end, I think the challenge will be, after the election, two things. One is how to deal with the new Lebanese government, which at best will have probably a March 8 veto, at worst, best or worst, whatever, or could have a March 8 majority. How to deal with that in a constructive way, in a creative way. But more importantly, how to deal with the Syrian-Israeli track, which is really, in the end, what will make or break Lebanon in the long run. Everything else is sort of, getting by this year and, patching things together. But what Lebanon really needs to get out of this, after 40 years of non-statehood, really, is a major change, and that major change is clear. The deal is clear. It's doable. It's a signable deal. But the U.S. probably, particularly with the new Israeli government, is going to probably have to take clearer stand, tougher. I don't know how, but has to deal with that in order to make this happen. That is the only way Lebanon can ever really re-emerge.
Yes, the last question, please, on your side.
Bill Hoffman with the American University of Beirut. I found myself attracted to Karim's Pollyannish scenario, and would be grateful to have some comment about, since Iran hasn't educated the people in South Lebanon, and others haven't, and the Palestinians, no one has risen up to do this for the Palestinians. Is this a role for the U.S. government?
I'm the American private sector. We do hire AUB graduates. I forget who said it earlier, so forgive me if I'm stealing their talking point. There are many important and good changes have happened in this region of the world in the last 10 years or so. A modest trend toward popular legitimacy is one of them. Another is the abundance now of communications, movements of people, money across borders within the Arab world. The fact that the Gulf is an epicenter of globalization. When I joined the American Foreign Service, you flew to Pakistan through Frankfurt, Germany, or London, England. Today, if you fly from New York, chances are you're going through Doha or Dubai. I think these kind of social and educational patterns are enormously influential in human life. And if that's true, if I'm right that those things are happening, then soft power becomes hugely relevant because it diminishes the message of the other side, which at the end of the day is not a very inspiring one. And I don't think moves people beyond the first question, to be honest. Now, whether the American government can play a role in doing some of those things, certainly we can. And historically, in educational institutions, we have tried to do that. But even those patterns are changing now. What I think is, to me, in looking back, is most worrisome is. Let me give you an interesting little fact. The Saudi students in the United States now rank in the top 10 foreign populations here. That wasn't true a number of years ago, but that trend has happily been restored. There isn't a destination in the Middle East that ranks in the top 20 for American students, despite the enormous focus of our country on this region of the world. I think, we ought to wake up and smell the hummus and see that we've got a certain amount of work as a society and culture to do ourselves.
please join me in thanking our three panelists, and thank you.